Thanks for choosing to listen to this Late Night Linux Family podcast. We're only able to do this because of the people who support us. None of our shows are paywalled, but our Patreon supporters can get most episodes early and never hear any ads. Learn more at latenightlinux.com/support or support us by telling a friend or colleague about everything we do. 2.5 Admins, episode 314. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, we've got a plug for the Open ZFS User and Developer Summit 2026. The call for papers is open until September 11th. And you're going to be at this conference, Alan.
Yes, I'll be there presenting as well. So yeah, this is the OpenZFS User and Developer Summit. So 2 days of the content will be specific to end users, and then the other 2 days will be the developers working on next new features and so on. You're obviously invited to all 4 days, but we'd love to hear some talks from non-developers as well. So if you just have interesting experience or interesting use case for ZFS, we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, so this is October 27th to 30th in Portland, Oregon. And you've got a webinar to plug.
Yes, coming up on September 2nd at 11 a.m. Eastern, I'll be joined by FreeBSD Security Officer Gordon Tetlow to talk about FreeBSD security in production, vulnerability response, and operational best practices. We're looking at 4 or 5x the normal number of vulnerabilities in a year this year. It's good to brush up on your procedures and understand how the process works from the FreeBSD project side as well.
Right, well, links to both of those in the show notes. NinePBS sues Iron Mountain over blocked access to archival data.
Yeah, so this one's interesting when you look at the kind of the parties involved. So there's NinePBS, which is a local affiliate station of the public broadcaster in the US, and they had an archive with the last 70 years of all their what they've aired on their TV shows, and maybe it's the only copy of all of that archive of old TV shows. And then they paid a hosting company called Open Source Storage to store that and archive it for them. And it turned out that Open Source Storage bought data center space from Iron Mountain, which is a big data center provider, to host that in. And then one day, Open Source Storage kind of went defunct. It seems like the last employee quit and there was nobody left to keep the lights on. And so when PBS couldn't get an answer from them, and knowing that in this case, the open source storage people stopped paying Iron Mountain for the data center space, NinePBS sued to ask Iron Mountain to not delete or destroy the data until they could get a copy. Because, the company they would normally deal with isn't really answering at the moment. And Iron Mountain's like, well, these aren't our servers, they're open source storage's servers, so we can't just give you access to those. But at the same time, they owe us money and we're not going to keep them online either. And so the court had to get involved, and eventually a judge ruled that Iron Mountain would have to make the servers available for NinePBS to basically pay someone to go in and get their files out of there. But at the same time that NinePBS would have to indemnify Iron Mountain that if, when they go in there to get their files, if they corrupt some other files on it, that it's not Iron Mountain's fault because they're being forced by the court to give access to NinePBS. And so it's pretty interesting to look at the steps they had to go through to try to get their data back. In this case, the fact that they had an option is interesting because depending on how the setup had gone with, if they had been a different cloud provider or something, they might not have had a recourse. The data might have been gone as soon as nobody paid for it. And it wasn't on, a bunch of bits of actual metal that are sitting in a storage warehouse somewhere because somebody stopped paying for them. But it's still machines that oftentimes the data center is trying to hold hostage to get the rest of their money.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't really want to delete the data, would you?
No, but they might auction the servers off to try to get some of their money back. And then whoever buys them is like, this isn't my data. I don't care.
Yeah.
And so PBS is saying hey, don't let them get rid of these servers until we get our data back.
Or whoever buys them says, this is my data now, and I do care. Yay.
It's like, hey, PBS, you want your data back? It'll be lots of money.
Legally speaking, this is only novel because computer. This is pretty much the way it always works when somebody goes bankrupt or defaults on payments or whatever. You always have this kind of custody dispute going on. Once again, I used to work collections for a rent-owned store, and one of the things that you would see is, for example, now we didn't rent custom rims, wheels that you can put on your car, but that is a thing that people do. They'll rent luxury wheels to put on their piece of crap car, And then they stop making the payments on their piece of crap car, and the car that's actually worth less than the rented wheels winds up in an impound lot somewhere. Well, the impound lot is not going to let the people who own those super expensive wheels just come in and get the wheels. And in fact, you frequently have this kind of, legal dispute quite a lot, because what the impound lot wants to do is they want to use those expensive wheels as both a sword to hold over the head of the person who owes money on the car note to begin with. And they also want that value, if they can manage it, if and when they wind up having to auction the whole thing off, because again, the wheels are worth more than the car. So legally speaking, none of this is really novel. One thing that is also not novel is the peanut gallery on the internet chiming in, well, this is all just dumb. They shouldn't have been using cloud storage anyway. They should have just stored it locally. And that is arguable, but I think as usual, the punters kind of gloss over the details a little bit. One of the most common arguments I see is that, well, that's only a few modern hard drives worth of data. So they should have just bought a few hard drives and chucked it on those hard drives locally, and they would be in so much better position, and they probably would have spent much less money. And this gets justified by looking at prices for systems like Amazon S3 or Azure Blob. Now, 50 terabytes worth of data, which is what we're talking about here, would cost a whopping $11,500 a month to store on S3 or $7,500 a month to store on Azure. And obviously, yes, compared to roughly $4,000 worth of hard drives, that's a no-brainer. You should have bought the hard drives. Heck, you should have bought a couple of sets of those hard drives and set up your own replication and the whole nine. With that said, now we're talking about also needing somebody who actually can set that up and is responsible for setting it up. And that might be a little bit more money, particularly when you look at the fact that although we don't know for sure what open source storage we're doing, we did see a comment from somebody on Ars Technica who said that they had contracted with the same business from a media company that they used to work for, and that the way the company actually worked was they accepted uploads and stored them on 2 LTO tapes, one of which went into archival storage, and the other you could read things from online, apparently. So that's probably a lot more like AWS Glacier than it is like S3. And again, being fair, 50 terabytes on Glacier will only cost you about $180 a month, or $2,165 a year. Now, with that said, you're still buying those hard drives in only a couple of years. So personally, I still really don't think the value is there for cloud storage. And even more so when you look at the cost of retrieving your data from Glacier, because guess what? You have to pay again if you want the data back, and it costs 10 times as much as you pay per month to keep the data there.
Sure, having the server and the power and stuff does cost a bit, but being a media company, meaning that they need machines where they edit the video on and so on anyway, it seems like this is just an adjunct to that you don't need a whole different, like you're not building just an archival system. It would be like you're generating media all the time and you're needing to store that for both active editing and so on, and then archival. So it seems like something they probably are doing already, and it's just a matter of expanding the scope a little bit, so that maybe makes the costs more incremental than standing up a whole new thing just to do this storage. But at the same time, like, I understand their compulsion to just want it to be somebody else's problem, especially an archive that never changes, right? It's not something where you immediately picture wanting an active file system all the time. But at the same time, when you want to go back to that archive, you really want to make sure it's good. And that means actually checking it on a regular basis. And, a ZFS scrub is a great way to be able to prove that all that data is still intact every month or something. Whereas doing a compare job off the tape, first of all, requires you have some other source of it that is correct to compare to.
Well, it does sound like there was at least one server with spinning drives in it, because in the court documents, or at least in the reporting of the court documents, there's talk about them being really scared to turn off the server because they're worried that they won't get the data when they turn it back on again. So there was presumably at least 2 copies of it, but it's hard to say.
Schrodinger's copies, sure.
Yeah.
If both copies don't have checksums, how do you tell which one's right when they differ?
Well, yeah.
You just know something is wrong, but you don't know which one.
And if both copies were at the same defunct company that defaulted on all of its payments to where it kept its data, did you ever have 2 copies to begin with, or did you just have the one?
Well, yeah. I mean, that company should have been taking care of their off-site version of it, and they should have had, ideally, an on-site version of it at least. And then it'd be like, oh, bummer, our offsite's gone. We need to find a new one and, replicate or copy all of our stuff, all of our 50 terabytes off to somewhere else now. And that would have been a headache, sure, but it wouldn't have been like a nightmare.
I come from a broadcast family, and my dad was a broadcast engineer, and every single teeny tiny, nobody cared about it, little AM radio station anywhere had a broadcast engineer on salary, either part-time or full-time, to keep the equipment running, because that was core to the business. That's how you get the music or the talk shows or the whatever it is you're broadcasting out to people. Well, this isn't the 80s or the 90s. This is the 2020s, and IT is the way that the media both gets created and distributed. And I don't think that it's fiscally responsible to have a television station without some competent IT staff any more than it would have been responsible to have a television or a radio station in the 80s or 90s that didn't have a broadcast engineer. Because what do you do when it breaks? It's gonna break, and it's absolutely core to your business. You need to be able to handle it when it does.
Yeah, and especially part of the thing with the broadcast engineer was your license to be able to broadcast says you can't broadcast dead air for more than a couple of seconds. And so the system has to be reliable. And if you have an obligation to keep that 70-year-old content and be able to bring it up when you need it, then you need to be taking this more seriously than one fly-by-night vendor.
And honestly, I hate to say it, but the locally hosted option is the simplest option for people who aren't really heavily up on their IT skills to actually keep on top of, because it's pretty easy to look at scrubs. It's pretty easy to look at records of these things. It's pretty easy to literally just poke around and see if the files are there and responsive versus, well, we saved a bunch of money, theoretically, by putting this stuff on Glacier, where it'll take 2 years for the cost of the Glacier payments to add up to the cost of the hard drives. All right, that's great. Not that 2 years is that long of a time anyway, when you're probably going to expect a decade or more out of the drives. But now that it's on Glacier, not only are you spending that money to keep it up there, but it's a backup. What's a backup that you don't test? It's not a backup at all, right? So now you need somebody who's capable of downloading all that back again, verifying it every once in a while to make sure that all that stuff is good. That's going to incur those additional, very hefty costs of retrieving the data back out of Glacier. Very rapidly, we come back to the point where it's actually simpler as well as cheaper just to do local storage, locally managed. And that is a thing that, if you don't want to pay somebody on salary to manage that for you, well, then, yeah, you can contract for that as well. But at least it's a little closer under your eyes and under your own supervision, and it's a little easier for you, the organization, to be certain that what should be done is done.
Yeah, if the machines are physically at your site, then if the company you're paying for support goes away, you could hire someone else and be like, here's the physical machine, check on my files. Whereas when it's locked in another company's data center and they want their money, if you read the court documents, NinePBS has had to pay all of the overdue fees from this company to Iron Mountain in order to get access to the servers.
Which is not unreasonable, is it, from Iron Mountain's point of view?
It's not unreasonable from Iron Mountain's point of view, but for NinePBS, they had to pay all of their providers overdue bills for all of the stuff stored there, not just NinePBS's data, in order to maybe be able to get access to their data. They don't actually know how much of what's on that server is actually still good or whatever.
In other words, this was not an effective cost-saving measure.
Exactly.
The patch window is collapsing. Why security needs a new control plane. This is a piece on the Azure blog from Igor Sakhnov.
So yeah, it's not necessarily new advice, but the advice for the last couple of years had been, we need to move away from considering, everything inside the network is safe and everything from outside is bad. And having these perimeter firewalls isn't good enough anymore because, some of the attacks might come from inside. And with work from home, you can't really tell what's inside the office and what's outside the office and so on. So we moved to all this, we got to put all the defenses on the endpoint and do it this way. And now they're coming back that, with AI, they're finding vulnerabilities faster than we can fix them. Or even before we've had it, it gets disclosed to us and maybe we're trying to make a fix for it. But in the meantime, somebody else has independently found the same thing by running a similar AI and is exploiting it in the wild. And the patches can't come quick enough for you.
And crucially, exploits are being written by the AI as well. It used to be people would find the vulnerability and then someone would have to work out how to exploit it, whereas now the bot just tells you how to do it.
Right. And if the bot tells you how to do it, the bot probably also told someone else how to do it. So you don't have the luxury of waiting 90 days for Microsoft to roll out a patch for it or whatever. So they're saying, we need to go back to looking at network enforcement protection as well. Restricting access to vulnerable systems, limiting exposure to attack paths, reducing opportunities for people to jump around inside your network once they get a foothold, and, trying to segment off high-risk assets and all the things that have been common sense for years, but that we were told weren't good enough anymore. It turns out security is the layers of Swiss cheese where they all have holes in them, and we were trying to have enough layers that there's not a clear path through from one side to the other.
I'm just going to read from the midpoint of this article when Igor actually gets to his recommendations. Why the network is emerging as the fastest control plane. When a workload cannot immediately defend itself, another layer must help provide protection. Increasingly, organizations are looking to the network. Unlike endpoint controls, network-level protections operate around workloads rather than inside them. This distinction becomes particularly important during periods of elevated risk. The network already understands communication patterns, connectivity requirements, trust relationships, and traffic flows. It sits at a strategic position where organizations can influence how systems interact with one another without necessarily modifying the applications themselves. So the short version here is that Igor is recommending that when a vulnerability is being exploited and you don't have a patch for it, you cut off the attacker's access to the vulnerable API or endpoint, which doesn't really seem like amazing, groundbreaking new ideas here. You could a little bit more charitably position this as advice. Well, if there's an attack that's compromising a vulnerability that you don't have a patch for that exploit, maybe you could shift things around in this particular path in your application so that, this one thing that targets the vulnerable API, you turn off, again, by firewalling things off, at the network level. And I'm just not sure how seriously we're supposed to take somebody in 2026 telling us as though it's a brand new idea. Hey, have you considered turning the thing off of the network if it's vulnerable to attackers on the network?
Well, they get into a little more nuance. They have an example here of if there was a new HTTP 2 denial of service vulnerability. The classic way to solve that would, we'll just disable HTTP 2 and fall back to using old HTTP 1.1 until the system is patched. But that might have, significant application and performance impact, right? It's going to make everything too slow. So they're saying a more robust AI-driven network and workload-aware response system might be able to say, limit how many concurrent streams each IP address can have, add constraints where each request can't be bigger than this, or each IP address is only allowed to make so many requests per second, or maybe overall we're only allowing so many requests per second in order to try to reduce the chance of the vulnerability getting hit, or a smaller number of IP addresses being able to do the denial of service enough to actually interrupt your service. Which isn't bad, but it's not novel.
Is that not just standard network admin stuff, though?
Yes.
Kind of. They're just saying that if you use an AI, you might be able to find the patterns more easily than manually doing it by reading log files and trying to adapt to what the attacker keeps changing. So it is mostly the same thing, maybe just slightly accelerated by having more tools in the loop.
Slightly accelerated by not bothering to think about anything and letting the robot do it for you and hoping for the best. Surely everything will turn out grand.
Well, you don't even fail to ban, Jim, so I'm not surprised that you've got that attitude.
That's an excellent point. I meant to bring that up. Yes, a large part of this, it feels like Igor doesn't want to just come right out and say, hey, let AI manage your network for you and it'll detect that attacker and cut them off before you even have a chance to think about it. But if that's not what he's saying, I'm not sure what he is. And Joe's example of fail to ban is a great one. I have been railing against fail to ban for literal decades now because although it's very, very popular, what fail to ban really is a way to let attackers directly manipulate your firewall rules. Not a great idea. And similarly, I don't think it's a great idea to hand over control of your firewall rules to the robot. Does it see something you don't? Maybe. Is that thing real? Again, maybe. Is the thing that the robot's going to try to do to resolve what it thinks is a problem that you might or might not have seen, is that going to be a good idea without any really catastrophic follow-on effects? Again, maybe.
Well, youth and experience and bravado is going to make me argue on this with you, Jim. yes, fail to ban lets an attacker make changes to your firewall, but it closes it down. It's not opening it up.
Which is great, as long as you don't mind an attacker being able to DOS whatever that service is.
Well, I guess.
At the same time, sometimes it's the only defense. Like SSH has gotten some more internal defenses where when it gets too many sessions, it drops 10% of them instead of just all of them so that somebody can't easily lock you out of your own box as much. But yeah. But, we've also seen these same things go bad. A friend of mine works at a school district and, their new AI security system used by the provider of their email was like, oh, this account logged in from a Linux box. That's definitely suspicious. Let's lock them out of their email. He's like, but that's what I always do. This isn't something new that I started doing. Why am I suddenly violating security policy for using a more secure operating system?
It's like when Google panics every time I log into my email on a new ThinkPad installation of Linux. Like, it's coming from my IP. It's a Linux box. It's obviously me. Come on.
At this point, Google should just be checking the MAC address, seeing that that's coming out of a ThinkPad and being like, oh yeah, that's one of Joe's.
Exactly.
I thought that was the promise of this AI stuff, that it would learn these patterns.
In all honesty, though, that we really are kind of dancing around a lot of the problem that I have with these, modern concepts of like, oh, we'll just have AI manage the network and it already sees all your flows and knows what's normal and not normal and can, act quickly to shut things off. A lot of the problem here is that we're talking about acting on hunches. When you let the AI do the thing because the AI thinks it's a good idea, the AI, generally speaking, it can't explain why it thought that was a good idea. That is an emerging technology where you have an AI actually decide when to follow rules and write down why it decided to do a thing when it did it. But generally speaking, that's not what modern AI does. It's not much different than hiring somebody and saying, hey, we want you to fight network abuse, do whatever you want to with the firewall whenever you want to do it, and you do not have to justify your actions.
Well, if I'm being paid to make the machine entirely secure, I can just unplug it from the wall and encase it in concrete and then get paid forever, right?
Which is exactly the kind of shortcut models have been known to take.
There's actually a great example of this from a week or two ago with American Airlines deployed their new AI that's designed to rebook you onto a later flight if you're going to miss your connection. Of course, it doesn't do this because it wants to make sure you make your connection. It does this because if you might miss your connection, they could sell your seat to someone else. And so for maybe about 10% of the cases, it maybe bumps you even though you were going to make it in time because it thinks it can sell your seat for more than you paid for it.
Oh, capitalism. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Bert Yan writes, I've installed OpenMedia Vault 8 and I have 3 disks. One pool called Pool and some file systems. It's called that by OpenMedia Vault, with backups, Docker, media, test, games, etc. But I hear you guys talking about vdevs. Is it maybe smarter for me to put media in a whole new pool, or Docker and backups in a separate pool? What is a vdev, or is that a file system?
I think let's start out with the last question that you asked, because I think that really underpins everything else that you had a question about, and that is, what is a vdev, or is that a file system? So a ZFS pool is a logical arrangement of storage. You can have as many file systems as you want inside a pool. They can be as individually as large or as small as you want within the overall capacity of the pool itself. VDEVs are essentially like simple RAID arrays. You can have more than one of them in a pool. A pool can be, at its absolute most simple, a single disk. That's only one VDEV, and it's a one-disk VDEV. That's as simple as it can possibly get. But you can also have mirror VDEVs, which are like RAID 1 arrays, but you can have lots of them. Having a lot of those mirror VDEVs in a pool makes it something that some people call RAID 10. It's really not. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's similar. You can also have multiple RAID Z1 or RAID Z2, which are like RAID 5 or RAID 6. But ultimately, these are the hardware parts that make up the pool, versus the file systems are the individual groupings of data the pool can offer. And just like a file system on a partition on a regular drive, they are actually separate systems with separate space accounting and separate everything. So like if you copy something across a dataset boundary, just like copying something across partitions, it has to be an actual block for block copy. You can't just move the sectors to the other side of it.
Yeah, so it sounds like what Open Media Vault is doing is already the right thing, right? You have separate file systems, which are ZFS datasets that pull space out of the pool and give it back when the space is free for your backups, Docker, media, tests, games, etc. So it sounds like it's already got you on the right path where you want the separate datasets for each of those. And with ZFS, that means you can set different settings for each, although most of the time, especially for a simple home NAS, you don't really need to go and tweak and tune anything if you don't want to. As far as separate pools, especially with only 3 disks, if you're doing multiple pools on that, you're basically talking about each disk having no redundancy, and you're much better off having those 3 disks together in something like a RAID Z1 that can withstand the failure of one of those disks and you still have all your data, versus if you try to have multiple pools, then if a disk dies, maybe it takes out all your media and that's all re-downloadable or whatever, but if it takes out your Docker, then a bunch of your services don't work or something, and nobody likes that.
The question about should I have more vdevs, that really doesn't come into play until you start talking about adding more disks. You said you have 3 disks now, which makes it sound at least like that's probably going to be a 3-wide RAID Z1, which, like I said, is functionally equivalent to RAID 5. Now let's say you buy 3 more drives. Now you could put those into the pool as another RAID Z1 vdev, and it just doubles the size and, for the most part, doubles-ish the data transfer rate that the pool is capable of, versus you could set up an entirely separate pool with those 3 drives. And now the two don't really have anything in common. They're completely separate. Usually this is not what you want to do. The only time that we really recommend that people might even think about having a complete second pool instead of just adding a vdev to an existing pool is if you want to isolate workloads from one another in a performance sense. Because if you've got 2 RAID Z1 vdevs in one pool, that pool is going to be faster. But the problem is, if one storage workload on that pool consumes the pool's entire performance, then other workloads will suffer. On the other hand, if you have 2 completely separate pools and you have one workload that goes, absolutely haywire, obnoxious, and steals all the performance on the pool that it's on, it's not going to have any impact on the other pool because they are actually separate pools, not just one big pool with multiple vdevs.
Yeah, and basically it cuts both ways. If you make a separate pool for your games, it means that the other stuff happening on your thing won't slow your game down, but it also means that if nothing else is happening, your game could have loaded twice as fast. So it's always a trade-off there. The other time we recommend separate pools is if you have one of hard drives and one of SSDs. Often you maybe actually want to keep those separate. Just mixing them together gets really hairy because ZFS will try to bias towards the faster drive, and then you'll fill up your SSDs and not get the advantage you want. You basically want to be able to decide what goes on the SSDs versus what doesn't.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at alanjude.com.
We'll see you next week.